The other day I did a quick search on YouTube for videos about sanding blocks, and I found a lot of them. Most of them were build videos about how to make the ultimate sanding block, usually featuring different ways to hold a piece of sandpaper on a chunk of hardwood. Some of them are really clever, but the fact is not all sanding is best done with a hard, flat block of wood. Sometimes you need some give in the block to smooth the surface that might not be perfectly flat. Other times you may want a really soft block that will conform to a profile, or even a block that's specifically shaped to a complex molding. Today we'll talk about different types of sanding blocks with different purposes in the shop. You may find that you're limiting yourself too much by the type of block you're using. First of all, why would you use a sanding block at all when you could use a power tool and save a lot of effort? Power tools sand quickly, but they don't always sand well. Even if you manage to avoid the obvious swirls and pigtails, a rotary sanded surface will always look like a rotary sanded surface. When the light hits the finish, any scratches across the grain will be visible. So while you may do the bulk of your work with a power sander, it pays to then go back and hand sand the most visible surfaces with a final grit or two. And there are other effects you can achieve from hand sanding that we'll discuss as we consider 4 categories of sanding blocks. We'll talk about rigid, semi-rigid, flexible, and contoured. Let's begin with rigid sanding blocks. This one couldn't be simpler. It's a scrap of hardwood or plywood with some self-adhesive sandpaper attached to it. I buy PSA-backed sandpaper in rolls. I'll put a link to what I use below this video. This type of paper is very durable and long-lasting, and it has countless uses around the shop, including sticking it to a chunk of wood to make a rigid sanding block in about 10 seconds. Rigid sanding blocks are good for squaring, fitting, and leveling project parts. For example, if I sand this edge with a soft sanding block, I'll likely round over the corners. Sometimes I want that softening effect, but other times I want everything to remain crisp and sharp. A rigid sanding block will maintain those sharp edges. A rigid sanding block may also be used to square an edge. For example, this edge may be 90 degrees to the surface of the board when it comes off the saw, but as I sand, I may unknowingly put more pressure on one side of the block than the other, causing a slightly beveled or sloping edge. A sanding block like this one, with a side that is perfectly 90 degrees to the sole, may be used to ensure that the edge of the workpiece remains perfectly square to the surface of the workpiece. This type of rigid sanding block may also be used to precisely fit a project part by trimming the end square or even to fine-tune a miter. Again, the key is the side that is square to the sole of the block, which maintains a square edge or end on the workpiece. This particular block is covered with carbide grit, which seems to last forever. I get these from Duragrit, and I reach for them all the time because I never have to change the paper. They're always ready to go. And they're really versatile. I highly recommend picking up at least a 120 grit. I'll link to them below this video. Another use for a rigid sanding block is to level a surface. Sometimes a perfectly flat surface isn't necessary. We'll talk about that shortly. But other times you want a surface that is dead flat, and you can achieve that with a large, flat, rigid sanding block. This is the same principle that's governed hand planes for centuries. If you wanted a straight edge or a flat surface, you used a long, large plane with a sole that wouldn't follow the dips in the surface like a boat at sea, but would instead span across the high points, shaving them down all to the same level. That same effect can be achieved with a large, flat, rigid sanding block, though the process will be a little slower and dustier. A semi-rigid sanding block is very much like the sole of a power sander, which is padded to allow the sandpaper to conform to slight variations in a surface. Not all surfaces have to be perfectly flat, so why sand away a bunch of wood to get it that way? Power sanders kind of go with the flow. They follow the gradual rise and fall of the surface. And when you follow up with a semi-rigid sanding block for your final grit, you save yourself a lot of unnecessary leveling work. Another thing to consider is while a rigid sanding block will maintain crisp edges, in many cases you don't want the edges of your projects to feel sharp. A semi-rigid sanding block can ease them just enough to be pleasant to the touch without making them appear too rounded over. Cork is actually an ideal material for a semi-rigid sanding block. Not only does it provide just the right amount of give, but the body of the block is very comfortable to hold over long periods. You can buy ready-made sanding blocks made from cork online for between $5 and $10 each, or you can make your own from a big block of cork. Where do you get a big block of cork? I buy yoga blocks. I'll link to the ones I get below this video. They come usually in a 2-pack, and you can get 18 good-sized sanding blocks from these 2 bricks. It's enough to last a lifetime for what works out to be about $2 each. Or you can cut these into any size or shape that you need. Many project parts are flat and square, but some aren't. That's where flexible sanding blocks come in. In our shop, we buy sanding sponges online. You can buy these things in hardware stores, but those are usually sold for sanding drywall, so they may not be the grit or the quality you want. I'll link to the ones I buy below this video. I like these in particular because they last longer than the cheaper ones. But here's a hint. Just buy the medium grit. It's coarse enough for rougher sanding and shaping in places where a power sander won't go, but fine enough that you can follow it up with just some light sanding with finer paper and save yourself the expense of getting the finer grit sponges. In fact, you can wrap a piece of finer paper around this sponge for the same effect. While flexible sanding blocks can be smashed to conform to any profile shape, you'll be applying more pressure to the high points of that profile, and that may change its shape more than you like. That's where contoured sanding blocks come in. These are pool noodles. They're foam flotation devices used in swimming pools. They're cheap, they come in various sizes, and they fit into different shapes of coves, such as for crown moldings. You just wrap a piece of sandpaper around a chunk, and off you go. Pipe insulation tubes can serve the same purpose for smaller coves. For smaller yet, you could try backer rod, which is the same foam material but sold for filling gaps around doors and windows. I also like these little rubber profile sanders that you wrap in paper. They can be used to get into just about any shape in any profile. I'll link to these below the video. Of course, if you have a lot of complex moldings to sand, such as crowns or baseboards for a room, or these moldings we made for a cabinet door project, it would take forever to sand each part of the profile separately. There is a company that makes sanding blocks that match some of the common profiles of trim you buy in home centers. And if you make your own crown moldings with custom knives and a molding machine, you may be able to get a custom sanding block that matches the profile. MyWoodcutters.com will take care of that for you. So let's sum things up. I do most of my sanding with a power tool, but on surfaces that will be seen and touched, I finish up with hand sanding with the grain with finer grits. Most of the time I do that with a semi-rigid sanding block to save unnecessary leveling work and to slightly ease my edges. But if I need a perfectly flat surface and crisp, sharp edges, I reach for a rigid sanding block. When I want to square an edge or fit a workpiece, I reach for a rigid sanding block that's designed specifically for that. And if I'm sanding a rounded or contoured surface or I'm shaping project parts, I like sanding sponges. If I'm sanding a heavily contoured surface or a complex profile, I use various pieces of foam or rubber wrapped in sandpaper, or if I can get one, a custom profile block. You'll find that all of these types of sanding blocks are useful in your shop. Now, what kind of sandpaper should you use and which grits? We already made that video. I'll link to it below so you can check it out. See you next time. I've been using Duragrit carbide sanding products for years, and I still haven't worn out the first ones I bought. If I have a rough edge to smooth, a corner to chamfer, or a curve to shape, more often than not, I'm reaching for one of these cleverly designed tools. It's one of those workshop secrets I wish I'd discovered long ago. Check out the link below this video to see for yourself. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.